question of women. Who's in leadership? And how is that exercised? How is that leadership exercised?
But then how do you, okay, so you put this pastor here in a congregation that doesn't look anything like them. How do you, I'm not saying just the United Methodist Church, but churches in general, how do you help the congregation as well as the pastor recognize that don't get so caught up in what the messenger looks like, listen to what the message is? How do you help congregations to move beyond their own prejudice?
You want that in 25 words or less? I don't have a short answer for it, but just one or two brief comments. The messenger is the message. We can't separate them. Right? You know, I mean, we've been having a conversation as a faculty about the way in which some students respond in certain course contexts to a professor who's not white or a professor who's not male or not white male. The messenger is the message at the heart. Right? So how do we deal with it? What are the issues we have to work with? What are the practices that have to develop? What does it mean to be a community in worship? I mean, and what are the pieces of worship that can begin to extend that? And that, you know, maybe one of the things that starts to become an issue there is, so how is the peace exchanged in this congregation? Who exchanges the peace with whom? Right? How does that start to break down walls? Right? I mean, I'm just pointing at that little. I think one more question, then we have to stop because I've got to go actually do another class.
You do have another life, right?
Yeah, I have another life.
I was just going to build on his comment and sort of pose this a slightly different way. What if we think of critical awareness of habit formation as a habit, as a practice that needs to be built into this array of habits we're talking about? How do we do that?
Critical thinking is not, critical thinking is a skill that's learned. Right, so critical awareness is a skill that's learned. So how do we do that? There are, in terms of critical thinking, in an educational context, there are actually people who are writing about how to do that, how to practice that. And Stephen Brookfield, who's one of the predominant educational practitioner theorists right now. He's got actually a wonderful book about teaching critical thinking. And he says, so how do you do it? Well, do you launch people, do you launch people into reading the dogmatics? Or do you introduce them maybe through one of Bart's sermons? Right? He says, how do you, and he says, and do you start with something that's really close to them personally, or do you start with something that's at a distance? Right? So I mean, so he lays out this whole trajectory. Well, can we take some of the same kinds of concepts? And so I haven't thought about this. It's kind of off the top of my head. Can we take some of those same kind of concepts and think, well, what does that mean then in terms of shaping worship? So what's the relationship between transformation that's helping people? This goes to your question. How do we help people move into a new relationship by starting with someplace that's familiar or comfortable, but not leave them there, right? And how do we help them progress in that work of critical thinking? I think the same thing's true in worship. Right? So you don't start a new ministry. Some pastors haven't learned this yet. Some have learned the hard way. You don't start a new ministry by changing everything in worship on the first Sunday you arrive, because you'll be changed faster than they will. You don't start by simply tinkering with hymn texts. You teach. You lead people piece by piece into okay. So maybe man really doesn't mean everyone in 21st century North America. What do we do with it? Right? That's the conversation. All right. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Anderson. Warning on the next parking lot conversation, while you're talking, if Protestants also get short shrift to the ascension, so how do you ritualize not only the presence of Christ, but the absence? Right. I have no idea what that means.
All right, my class, I'll see you in 10 minutes.
I stay here for 10 minutes. No.
I said, I gotta go move my cup, I'll get a ticket.
Well, you better do that. Okay, now that the house guests are gone, we can talk about them. I just want to carry on the conversation for a bit before we take our break. So are there any other pressing questions that you wanted to ask but could not ask? Or give the opportunity. I mean, I won't try to answer them the same way Professor Anderson tried to answer them.
So this class is specifically for United Methodist, right?
He teaches a class in United Methodist worship, yes. But I think the fact of teaching out the seminar.
Can I go back on something William was saying?
No. No, yeah.
I'm wondering about your, I understand the aversion to setting one faction of the church up against another. I think it's a harsh reality that that's how things are. In some cases right now, that there are factions both within denominations and denominations against each other, that there's this notion of orthopraxy and like there's good practice and there's bad practice, that because there's good theology and there's bad theology. I'm just wondering, how do we, what's your compromise? Like, because I do think the notion of counter practice sets one faction against the other, but if we don't have counter practices, if we don't have exemplars of that which is good and that which is right, then are you more so concerned about the language?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, I think language, and that was really what I was driving at. Not that these are practices that embody and give witness to different theological witness,
Okay.
but that in setting it up as a counter practice, what we are actually doing in the examples that he offered was practicing worship in a way that reflects at least potentially the trajectory of Colossians, right? They're neither male nor female, nor Greek nor Jew.
Right.
And so that's the Christian practice. The idea is to have the practice align with the theology, and the degree to which there is seepage from dominant culture and or perpetuated Christian culture that is misaligned for good theological reasons, those practices ought to be revised. But to call it a counter practice is to, in a sense, legitimate that the other is a Christian practice.
How would you safely though, like, I agree, but how would you say that? Like, if your church is practicing racism, what word would you use instead of counter practice? So I think you're supposed to bring in like authentic practice?
No, just practice.
So, but like, how does?
Drop the adjective.
No, but I think here is something along the lines of this. Oftentimes people will say, the church is by definition a counterculture, has been and always will be. No. When the church is faithfully practicing its faith, it will often at times encounter things in culture to which it is opposed. But that doesn't mean it is by definition a counterculture.
So I'm like wondering which word I'm supposed to use. How do I handle that? If the practice, if the practice of the church is racist, then what do you?
You say, we have sinned, we need to repent and amend our practice.
Okay. So you just name it as sin. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I realize it's terribly unpopular,
No, I mean, I'm not uncomfortable with
No,
that.
I mean,
Like,
no.
I don't care.
So no, I think that's what, I think that what you're getting at is to say, what makes it true is not because it's countered. Because
Yes.
it's true, it oftentimes will be countered.
So rather than finding a pretty word to kind of soften what it is, just say what it is. And it.
It's racist, it's sin, and it's not Christian.
Can't the same critique though be applied to different theologies, liberation,
Yeah.
feminist?
Yeah, I mean, ask yourself always, do you need the adjectives? Or is it just theology?
Right.
It's like when some people say, well, social justice. No, it's justice.
But so far that argument isn't winning.
No, it's not.
How do you make that argument win?
And the problem being is because I think exactly what you're saying is that we want to soften it.
But doesn't change it, not using counter, doesn't that really only work for those that are in that dominant position as opposed to those that are not, that's going against something, saying, look, your practice, you need to counter your practice. So when it comes to those people who are on the outside, talking to the person that's on the other side, then it's more of, look, you need to, it's not the inside saying we need to change the way we practice.
Right.
But on the other side, it's like you guys need to counter your practice. So you need to practice, and so it works.
Or is it saying to the dominant group, you are practicing badly?
Well, isn't that what Jesus did?
Well, I don't know, I never knew.
Well, in your reading, isn't that what Jesus preached?
I'm sorry, that
That was rude.
was really.
I'll call it what it is.
It was rude. It was rude. I offended an awful lot of my evangelical friends.
But I think also, like Jesus, you could enter into subtle subversive acts that the dominant group would perceive to be counter to what they are engaged in and what historically they've been engaged in, which in their minds they think it's right. I mean, a lot of congregations really think that it's right, it's a good thing that we worship the way we are with the people that we are worshiping with. This is the way it should be. So for them, they see it as right. And what you're now doing is disturbing their rightness. And you're now demonized, even if you don't use the language as counter. I mean, I agree with you. I would prefer, the practice. So to piggyback off of you, if a church has issues with women being in leadership, there are ways like say lay leaders, lay speakers, or a pastor being intentional in inviting women to come and preach so that the congregation can be exposed. Pastor being intentional in inviting people of color to preach. I mean, I think to some degree, at least I'm United Methodist, I think it's kind of a sham when we talk about being inclusive and that type of thing and then sending a person of color to a congregation when the church has never exercised any intentionality in moving in that direction, whether it be worship, whether it be missional outreach or whatever, engaging persons of diverse backgrounds. So now you're going to put a person of color in that situation in which the church has never prepped for it, so I think the pastor, to be honest, I think at least in our structure, white pastors are complicit in the racist practices because they don't exercise the moral courage when they are appointed to churches to lead the congregation in the Jesus practice. So now you're setting up a pastor, a person of color, or even a woman when she is appointed in that situation. So the pastors are complicit. They have a stake in the game. They have privileges in which they benefit because of the way it's set up. Most of them know that either a woman or a person of color will not be appointed to top churches. you know? And until, you know, again, I think that, and when persons of color are appointed, then you know, like you talked about waiting. I agree, you have to wait. But I know from experience, at least I'm in the Florida conference, you know, after a year or two, the mutiny begins. So you go along with things for a year, but then when you, without even saying anything, the practices that you engage in, like lay speakers and half of them being people of color. Now the congregation sees that because you're choreographing during worship or having people of color come and preach. You know, they become disturbed by it. Or if there's an influx of people of color, that begins to raise the anxiety level, you know, within a congregation. So, you know, so you say practice. I mean, I think on one hand, I agree with you, but on the other hand, regarding the significance of how race is played out, you know, you may not use the language, but it is a counter practice that has to be employed in order for the church to move from where it is to where it needs to be, because that has been the practice on so-called American soil.
Where was your person from the Commission on Religion and Race? Where was your person from COSRA? Where was your representative? There are actual, now granted, people don't take them very seriously. Not all the people take them very seriously, but there are commissions that have been created by the United Methodist Church to handle this, to actually come in and say, we're going to help your congregation figure out how to handle the either outright or subtle racism that's taking place, how to monitor yourselves and how to make that better. Where was your district superintendent to come along and tell you about those people on those commissions that are available in your conference to come help? Where was that connectional system and how did it fail there?
Those voices are muffled. Not only that, I mean, we know that it's all about money on one level, apportionments. You know, if you're not paying apportionments, if you're not doing A, B, and C, then you can be doing the right thing. But now that you have those voices that are, you know, in conversation with the DS or the bishop, you're going to be out there.
Well, we're also going to be exploring to the standpoint that institutional responses, like commissions and things like that, unintentionally actually hinder the change.
And they have, like, they're pretty aware of where they do that as well.
Well, if they're aware, they wouldn't have commissions.
We just hear it all.
Back to your question, the interesting thing to pose, though, is what happens when the outside group is wrong?
When they are wrong?
Wrong, and I'm thinking like the Donatists, where they say, we have the counter practice of exclusion against the dominant group, which says no inclusion. I mean, that's an interesting thing to pose. We always assume that it's the outside group, the counter practice is right. But that historically is not necessarily the case. And I think we have to be aware of that we cannot overgeneralize when we start talking about it.
I think, aren't you overgeneralizing issues like racism and sexism right now? I mean, aren't you by even throwing them into those categories and saying, you know,
Well, who's you?
I mean specifically you, by saying, you know, I think we need to think of these things like larger, more specific, you know, more kind of vaguely. There's, you know, I know that for a fact my colleague is sharing an actual personal story that took place within the church. I know that those commissions that are so easy to dismiss or whatever actually do really great work of monitoring and have been a major role of people that want to become more self-aware of what their own actions are. You know, and nobody's perfect, but they've done some great things, and I think we have to be really careful when you just kind of say you know, like let's move this to what happens when the outside group is just wrong. I think it's kind of dodging some of the issues.
No, it's not to dismiss, it's to warn. Because we oftentimes get caught up, and that's when we're at our most vulnerable.
Okay.
So it's never to dismiss, but it's always to add on.
Okay. Yeah.
My job is not to make things vague and abstract. My job is to say, actually, the hard task of ethics comes with thinking as clearly as you can. Because there's always the unintended consequence. the result of imperfect knowledge, the result of good intentions gone terribly wrong. And that horrible thing of we desire good things badly.
Yeah.
So again, my job is not to dismiss. My job is to add on more. Okay.
I'm gonna add on to that. Well, because, I'm from the Oklahoma Conference. I consider myself from the Oklahoma Conference, and all these committees that you're talking about, they do a great job of trying to incorporate Hispanic ministers into Anglo churches.
Which committee?
Huh?
Which committees?
All these just different groups that the conference has put together to help incorporate. They're really trying to push Hispanic congregations, but not to be separate from Anglo churches, but be part of Anglo churches. And so there's a lot of committees that the conference has put together to try to make that happen. But a lot of the Hispanic pastors in the Oklahoma conference are pushing against that because they don't feel comfortable. And so as the Anglo church pushes that more because they're thinking they're doing the right thing, the Hispanic pastors there are thinking, you're just not listening to me because that's not what I want to do. And so for me, I'm so hesitant to go back to Oklahoma because I want to be in an Anglo church. But now I'm faced with the question of, if I go to an Anglo church, I'm putting the rest of my Hispanic colleagues in a position where other people are going to say, well, see, it's possible, he does it, why don't you do it? And so it puts me in a really awkward situation, and this is just two people trying to do the best thing that they could, the right thing in their mind. And I think that happens a lot, you just don't see it.
I think that's right. Yeah, it's fairly frustrating.
I think, I know you got to I think that as people of color, we have to think why we want to go into a cross-cultural, cross-racial appointment. I think it should happen, but most times it doesn't happen the other way around.
Right.
Where you have white clergy going into people of color congregations, so that you're really practicing as a church cross-cultural, cross-racial appointments. It has to work both ways, because then on the other side, I don't think there's any moral credibility to talk about these issues when it's not going both ways and we're comfortable going there, but we're not looking at what's happening here. Because the church should, I use the language of esteem, not agriculture. But, I mean, how do we show the wider world, this is what it means to be community, this is what it means to be human, the embracing of our fellow human beings across the stripes, So I think we have to ask, okay, why do I want to go there?
And wouldn't it become habitual when it no longer matters who affects that?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And, but we're certainly not there yet.
Right.
You're not going to get there until, at Methodist Church, we open up our conferences so you can do cross-cultural. Because Iowa, we have one African-American congregation, predominantly, one Korean, and no Filipino. But we have probably 15 Philippine pastors, 5 to 10 Korean pastors, 10 or 12 African. So they have no choice but to go, in the same way, the one African-American congregation, they don't want to be, they don't want to be the guinea pig of the one that gets the Caucasian female or male, or they've had a Filipino, that didn't go well either. So we open up our conferences, so we can send some from Iowa to Chicago, and Chicago to St. Louis, and Florida. I mean, that would be interesting.
So following our embodied practice, it's time for a break. Now, yes.
So we decide to use the adjective or not? I'm trying to, I raised and right, are we going to use it or not?
We're going to get a bad grade. But anyway, before we take the break, just one thing I want to emphasize too is to think through what does it really mean to also be an intergenerational church? Because, I mean, we segregate along those lines as well. And quick story, one of the few times I was asked to be a guest preacher, the church secretary is calling up to get the information. She says, okay, what scripture lesson do you want read? And I said, well, it's ever on the lectionary for that Sunday. Well, which one? And I said, well, all three. And she goes, we don't do all three. I said, you can do it. You can do it. And then she said, okay, what's your sermon title? I said, I don't do sermon titles. And she goes, well, we got to print something. And I said, well, print untitled. And then finally she said, and what props do you need for the children's sermon? And I said, I don't do children's sermons. And she goes, well, we always have children's sermon. We said, you have to get someone else to do it. That means it's a form of child abuse. I said, well, we parade the little critters, up there, and we think it's cute, and then we get rid of them. I said, when was the last time you asked the retired people to come and sit at the pastor's feet? Put them on display. Right? So it really is, I think, and I think it's important to think through, what does it mean, also, all the things we've been talking about, and also intergenerational. Because I think, I think I mentioned this before, to live in Evanston at my age is a very interesting experience, because when I have to walk back with the dreadful undergraduates back and forth between the apartment and the campus, I'm invisible. I mean, to the point where cyclists try to run me over.
That aren't supposed to be on the sidewalk anyway, but that's a whole nother
That's
conversation.
a different. But it is, it's really increasingly, I think, and the other part of it is these dreadful retirement kennels, homes, where we tend to deposit over people and shoot them away. So anyway, on that cheerful note, let's take a break and reconvene.